The moment I pressed my palm against the roof of that black Lexus and leaned toward the driver's window, I was certain I was doing everything right. I was following procedure. I was following instinct. And above all, I was following the advice of my training officer, Sergeant Dale Kruger, who had repeated the same line at the start of every shift for 6 weeks. Trust your gut, son. Out here, your gut keeps you alive. What I didn't know was that the man sitting calmly behind that steering wheel, hands folded in his lap, watching me with the patience of someone who has survived worse, was Deputy Chief Marcus Webb, head of the entire Metro Division. The man whose framed photograph hung in the hallway of every precinct in the city, including mine. I had walked past it that very evening on my way to briefing and never once stopped long enough to learn the face. When the backup unit pulled up behind me, lights strobing against the wet asphalt, I felt a brief pulse of relief. But instead of steadying the situation, Officer Reeves stepped out of his cruiser, walked directly to the driver's window, and snapped to attention. Not toward me, toward the man in the car. "Chief Webb, sir," he said, in a voice scrubbed clean of all its usual lazy confidence. "I'm very sorry for the inconvenience." The world tilted. The lights kept spinning. I was still standing there with my palm flat on the car roof, and I became aware of how cold the metal was beneath my hand. Cold, solid, and exactly where it had no business being. But that was not where it started. That was the moment the crack became visible. The beginning was 6 weeks earlier, in a borrowed uniform that still carried the faint ghost of someone else's fabric softener, the night I first rode with Kruger. I grew up in Millhaven, a mid-sized city divided not by any official map, but by the invisible geography that everyone understands and no one says aloud. I was 24 when I graduated the academy. My mother held both my hands and cried. My father shook mine once, firm and brief, the way he greeted men he genuinely respected. I had wanted this for 3 years, to be a real cop, the kind who left a neighborhood safer than he found it. I had memorized the use of force continuum, drilled de-escalation until it stopped feeling like a script, read every assigned case study and half the ones that weren't. In the academy, that made me diligent. On the street with Kruger, it apparently made me slow. "You think too much," Kruger told me on the 3rd night, drumming his thick fingers on the steering wheel as we idled outside a 24-hour diner. He had the build of a man who had once been physically imposing and was now just dense. 15 years on the force, 3 commendations, the settled authority of someone who has never been seriously questioned. He glanced sideways at me with the half-amused expression of someone watching a puppy try to figure out stairs. "Out here, you don't have time for philosophy. You read it, you call it, you move." He said it the way men like him say things they consider a gift. "You'll learn." I nodded and filed it under experience. That was my first mistake. I spent those early weeks watching Kruger carefully. He was at ease in a way I found genuinely impressive. Knew business owners by name along the main corridor, slapped hands with the regulars outside the corner store on 5th, cracked jokes at dispatch that made the whole room loosen. He was liked. And he had very specific ideas about which streets deserved attention, which cars warranted what he called a longer look, which drivers were worth 20 minutes of unhurried scrutiny that produced nothing. The first time I noticed the pattern, I told myself it wasn't one. We had made 3 stops in 2 hours along the South End, every driver a black man. Kruger had been pleasant in that particular way of his. Polite like a toll booth, doing the minimum courtesy and not a thread more. No citations, no warrants, nothing found. just pieces of the night taken from three men who had done nothing except exist in a car on a street Kruger had decided deserved watching. "Quiet night," he said as we pulled away from the last stop, with something almost satisfied in his voice. "Nothing shaking." I looked out the window and said nothing. Something settled in my chest, dense and unresolved, like a word I kept reaching for and couldn't find. The week after, Kruger went on administrative leave. A complaint had been filed. Nobody told me the specifics. The whole thing treated as minor weather rather than anything structural. I rode solo. It was the first time since the academy that I felt like I could breathe at my own rhythm. I worked the south end the same way I worked the north. No agenda, no targeted attention, stopping only when something gave me actual reason. Nothing happened. The shift was quiet and ordinary, and exactly what a shift was supposed to be. Kruger came back on Monday. Whatever had been filed against him hadn't found purchase. He dropped his bag on the chair beside mine, poured coffee like a man returning from vacation, and said, "Miss me?" with the grin of someone who has genuinely never entertained the possibility of real consequence. I smiled back. I hated myself for it. It was his first night back when the unease I'd been carrying for weeks finally sharpened into something I could name. We were parked on the overpass above Route 9 when a black Lexus LS glided onto the ramp below us. Smooth, deliberate, doing nothing wrong. Kruger watched it with the focused stillness of a man who has already decided. "Run the plates," he said. I hesitated half a second. "What's the cause?" He turned and looked at me. The grin was gone. "Run the plates, Harris." They came back clean. Registered, current, insured, no flags. I said so. Kruger put the cruiser in drive anyway. "Let's take a look," he said. Flat, final. The tone of a man for whom that phrase ends discussions rather than opens them. My stomach tightened. I thought about the 3 stops. I thought about the complaint that hadn't stuck. I thought about the photograph in the precinct hallway that I walked past every single shift without once stopping to look at it. I should have said something. I knew it then, the way you know things you aren't yet brave enough to act on. But I was 24 years old and 6 weeks out of the academy, and Kruger had 15 years and 3 commendations, and the weight of that pressed on me like a hand on the back of my neck. So I said nothing. I watched him hit the blues. I watched the Lexus ease onto the shoulder with the slow, deliberate precision of a man who has done this before, who has learned, through repetition he never should have had to repeat, exactly how to make everything that followed survivable. I got out of the car. The window was already down. The man inside, late 50s, silver-threaded hair, a charcoal blazer over a white shirt that somehow still looked pressed at midnight, looked up at me with an expression I had no easy category for. Not fear, not anger. Something older and more patient than either. Something that had hardened over years of exactly this. His hand stayed open on the wheel before I could ask. "Good evening, officer," he said. Low, level, the calm of a man who has learned that calm is the only armor that works. "License and registration, please," I said. My training voice, the one I'd practiced until the shake left it. He reached toward the glove compartment slowly, narrating as he moved. Reaching for the registration. 4 quiet words, and they landed somewhere behind my sternum with a weight that had nothing to do with procedure. He handed me the documents. The name printed there, Marcus Webb, meant nothing to me in that moment, because I had walked past his photograph for 6 weeks and never once slowed down to learn the face that went with it. That was when the second set of headlights crested the hill behind us. Officer Reeves walked past me like I wasn't there. That was the detail I kept returning to afterward. The way he simply moved around me, unhurried, as though I were a traffic cone left on the road. He stopped at the driver's window, straightened his spine, and rendered a salute sharper and more sincere than anything I had seen him produce in 6 weeks. "Chief Webb," he said quietly this time, almost like an apology compressed into 2 words. "We'll get this sorted right away, sir." I stood at the rear quarter panel of the Lexus and felt the license and registration in my hand. Marcus Webb, Deputy Chief, Metro Division, and felt the precinct hallway photograph finally assemble itself in my memory. Silver hair, the particular line of the jaw, the eyes that had been looking at me for 6 weeks from a frame I had walked past without stopping. My mouth went dry. Kruger had stepped out of the cruiser. I heard the door, then the gravel crunch of his footsteps, then a silence that told me he had stopped moving. I turned. He was standing 6 feet back with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and the expression on his face was something I had never seen there before. Not quite fear, not quite calculation, but the narrow country between the two. Chief Webb opened his door and stepped out with the unhurried ease of a man who has already decided the shape of what happens next. He was taller than I expected. He straightened his blazer with one deliberate motion, looked at me briefly, then shifted his gaze to Kruger and let it sit there. The silence stretched for what felt like a full minute, but was probably 4 seconds. "Sergeant Kruger," Webb said, and his voice was quiet the way a controlled fire is quiet. All the energy contained, none of it wasted. "You want to tell me what the probable cause was on this stop?" Kruger's jaw tightened. A muscle pulled in his cheek. "Routine traffic enforcement, sir. The vehicle was registered, insured, obeying every traffic law, and driven by a man in a blazer." Webb cut him off without raising his voice by a single degree. "I've been doing this job for 26 years. I know what a routine stop looks like." He turned to me, really looked, the way a person does when they're trying to understand rather than confirm. "How long have you been on the job, officer?" 6 weeks, sir," I said, steadier than I deserved. He nodded slowly. 6 weeks. He looked back at Kruger. "I'll need both your badge numbers. Full written report on my desk by 0800. Vehicle code cited, observations made, duration of stop. Everything." He held Kruger's gaze a moment longer. "We clear?" "Yes, sir," Kruger said. The confident looseness had left his voice entirely. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed with the lights on and thought about the report due by 8 in the morning. What it would mean to write it honestly, and what it would mean to write it any other way. At some point I made coffee, I didn't drink, and stood at the window watching the empty street below. I thought about the 3 men from 2 weeks ago. I thought about Marcus Webb reaching into his glove compartment, narrating the movement, reaching for the registration, in that quiet, practiced voice. I thought about what that kind of practice costs a person. How many stops over, how many years? How many times you have to narrate your own hands so that a 24-year-old rookie doesn't make a terrible decision on the shoulder of a highway. By 4 in the morning, I had decided. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote the truth. The 3 prior stops, the plates that came back clean, the phrase, "Let's take a look," delivered without cause. I wrote it precisely, without editorializing, because the facts alone were enough, and I knew it. I submitted the report at 6:47. Then I changed into my uniform and drove to the precinct. What came out 3 weeks into the internal affairs investigation, delivered to morning briefing in a plain manila folder, was that Kruger's history extended well past anything I had witnessed. 14 formal complaints over 8 years. 11 dismissed. 2 resulting in written warnings that lived in a filing cabinet and apparently troubled no one. The 14th had been filed by a man named Robert Ellis, a 38-year-old high school history teacher, stopped 4 times in 14 months on the same stretch of road by the same officer. His 7-page letter was documented carefully enough that it could not be shelved. That letter had landed on the desk of the Deputy Chief, Metro Division, who had read it and decided to see for himself. He had driven his personal vehicle. He had driven it within every traffic law. He had folded his hands in his lap and waited. I gave testimony at the disciplinary hearing on the 2nd day. I sat in a room with institutional carpeting and said, clearly, exactly what I had seen on exactly how many nights. Kruger sat across the room and did not look at me once. By the end of the 3rd day, the panel had heard from 6 witnesses, including Robert Ellis himself, the man with the reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, who turned out to be one of the 3 men from that quiet night on the South End corridor. 15 years on the force. 3 commendations. It was not enough. Kruger was dismissed, his pension revoked on grounds of sustained misconduct. The same system that had absorbed 14 complaints kept his departure on paper too. Official, irrevocable. A file that would follow his name wherever it went. I heard 4 months later that he had applied for a security position at a private firm. They had pulled his employment history. They had passed. 6 months after the night on the overpass, my new training officer, a 12-year veteran named Carla Mendez, handed me coffee on our first shift and said without preamble, "I hear you write good reports." I told her I tried. She gave me the appraising squint of someone deciding whether to invest in something. "Trying's not the standard," she said. "Accurate is the standard. Consistent is the standard. Every stop, every night, regardless of who's watching." She pulled onto the main corridor. "You good with that?" I told her I was, and I meant it in a way I hadn't been capable of 6 months before. Chief Webb passed me in the precinct hallway one morning in November, mid-conversation with command staff. He glanced over as I stepped aside, held the look for exactly 1 second. The same steady, unhurried eyes from the shoulder of Route 9. He gave me a single small nod. I nodded back. He kept walking. I stopped at his photograph on my way out that night. Stood there for a full minute in the empty hallway, looking at the face I had walked past 47 times without seeing. I thought about Robert Ellis in his classroom, describing to his students the way institutions change. Slowly, expensively, one person at a time, usually only after someone decides the cost of silence is finally too high. I put my cap on and walked out into the night. For the first time in 6 months, the uniform felt like mine.